This is the first Patreon request video. The concept here is the Disventure Camp Season 1 cast competing with reshuffled teams, randomized challenges, and with Chris and Chef circa Total Drama Island hosting, with Crystal there as well. Also, this is kind of a spoiler, but I might as well get it out of the way here. I know that Crystal being Chris's daughter was retconned out of Disventure Camp for copyright reasons, but I'm still keeping them related in some of my videos, including this one, since the Patreon requester wanted to keep it that way when I asked them. Not too much else to say, so let's get right into it. So this season doesn't have a character intro episode. The eliminations happen right from the jump. The pacing is going to move a lot faster, kind of like the Total Drama reboot, which is fitting since the first episode here is the first one of Reboot Season 2. Obviously, there would still be some character interactions before the challenge. As far as those go, Ashley and Will would be friendly with each other, but obviously nothing deep or romantic just yet. Gret would be plotting to turn other people into pawns, but without Gabby on her team, she sticks to the background for now intentionally. Jake and Dan are friendly-ish, and after the challenge, Lil still offers to make a 4-person alliance with Nick, except now it would consist of Alec and Fiore as well, since Will and Ashley aren't on her team anymore. They all accept the deal since, why not? And this moves Alec and Fiore closer together a little faster than in the original. Oh, and also everyone is off-put by Gabby's personality. So this challenge is pretty much the first round of Squid Game, but with Chef's grandma instead of the creepy doll thing. And the people I think would excel the most here are Will, Miriam, and Tom. Will is strong and too afraid to make any rash movements, and Tom can blend into the background with his training and deliberately not bringing too much attention to himself. They're both able to outlast everyone on the other team, and Tom gently tries to instill confidence in Will to move, since he hasn't moved at all yet, but he doesn't budge. And Tom is too worried about himself to commit to convincing him further. So he tries to run and gets sniped by Mrs. Hatchet. Miriam, still being very grumpy and biased against the younger generation, scares Will into running forward, which then causes Mrs. Hatchet to immediately snipe him as well. This makes Miriam angry and does a "why I oughta" as she rolls up her sleeves and walks towards Chef's grandma menacingly. Right as Chris says this is about to get ugly, the two old ladies quickly change their demeanor as it turns out Miriam and Chef's grandma go way back, and inexplicably start playing mahjong in the middle of the challenge. Yet, she can still snipe everyone while doing this. They tell Miriam to win the challenge, and she's like, "Nah, shut up youth, I'm playing here." Despite Lil's best efforts to capitalize on the distraction and sneak Fiore to the finish line, her entire alliance is repeatedly sniped by Chef's grandma to the point where they basically just give up. And Tom eventually sneaks by using camouflage and wins the challenge, right before the game of mahjong ends with Chef's grandma winning. Then Chef's grandma berates Chef for treating her friend poorly, referring to when he served crappy food to the contestants, which of course included Miriam, and was trying to scare her as well. She slaps him across the face and tells him she better not hear about trying to have an attitude with Miriam again, or else they're gonna have a problem. Chef nods yes without hesitation and runs away scared. Crystal calls him a baby when Chris says, "Yeah, while he's busy shaking that off, I'm gonna need you on kitchen duty." Crystal tries to argue, but Chris says she's an intern for the show for a reason, and she needs to do what he says if she wants some real skin in the game later. Anyway, time for the vote. With the alliance of 4 working together, I'd say it's pretty easy to say Gabby's getting voted out here. She irritates them the most, and beyond Jake and Dan also voting for her most likely, there's not much else to it. Gret has a moment alone after the elimination and says privately to the camera that after today's challenge, she thinks she found the perfect sucker to exploit. The second episode is the second one of the reboot, aka the Human Basketball Challenge. Gret finds a moment to talk to Will away from Ashley, and tells him he's a coward who needs all the help he can get. So she wants an alliance with him. He says sure, as long as Ashley can join too. Gret doesn't love the idea, but figures it's better to take the extra vote and suck up being the third wheel, rather than rock the boat this early. At least for now. Pretty much everyone goes down the 1-point chute being afraid of the others, and the score is relatively even until Lil notices that Fiore's maneuverability and lightweight make her their unintentional MVP. So she comes up with the idea to hold her hand and tell her exactly when to jump so they can keep racking up points. Fiore starts to get really aggravated, but doesn't put a stop to it since it is working. So she just points at Lil and says, "We better win." Ashley tells Will and Gret they have to start at least going down the 2-point chute if they want to catch up. And Gret refuses, saying it won't matter since Will is too much of a coward to even up the score anyway. It seems like Will is going to prove her right, until Ashley holds his hand and tells him to breathe in and out slowly and calm down. This manages to calm Will down for a short period of time, just long enough to get them inside the chute before he starts freaking out again. Will ends up missing the net, but Ashley goes in without a scratch, scoring 2 points. Will refuses to go again, and Ashley tells him she understands. So she gets enough points to start catching up again by herself. Tom leaves in the middle of the challenge to see about his job, and with his team already in the lead, Jake wanders off to follow him. Tom awkwardly says hi, but then insists he has to go, which just makes Jake all the more curious about him. When he returns, Dan tells Jake to get his head in the game, pointing out that if they lose, the 4-person alliance is going to pick them off. I suspect that Dan would already catch wind of these four working together because, I don't know, he's just kind of perceptive, I guess. Jake isn't too worried since they're still in the lead, until Fiore says she's done being a basketball, and Alec rushes to her defense when Lil wants to continue, saying she's a child and she's done enough. This makes Jake and Dan go for the 3-point shoots out of desperation, and they get a 3-point lead on the other team. Gret sees the way Will looks at Ashley with a glow in his eye, as she makes each hoop, giving her an idea for how to motivate him. She tells him that in order to impress Ashley, he has to go through the 10-point shoot, which Crystal has been safety checking the whole time, and was considered out of the challenge, quote-unquote, officially by Chris, like in the original. This convinces Will to walk up to the shoot, but fear kicks in and stops him from actually going in. Gret tells him it's okay, but then feigns tripping as she knocks him into the shoot, saying, "Oops," with a smirk. Will ends up getting the 10 points, which wins his team the challenge, with nobody besides Miriam suspicious that Gret pushed him on purpose, though she keeps that to herself for now. Unfortunately for Will, he just barely ends up missing, meaning that it was all for nothing, but nobody besides Miriam is suspicious that Gret pushed him on purpose, though she keeps that to herself for now, meaning that the killer bass win. Before the vote, Gret would notice Will is nervous and desperate, so she tells him he's screwed for sure unless he follows her lead, and afterwards, he owes her his vote in a future round no matter what. Miriam, Ellie, and Drew all vote for Will being a coward and a potential liability, but Gret, Ashley, and Will vote for Drew, and Gret lies about Drew catching onto Tom's secret to get his vote like in the original, making it 4-3, and Drew is eliminated. Will says, "Whew, that was close," and Gret puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "What would you do without me?" Now, this episode is uncomfortable, to say the least. It consisted of Crystal forcing the competitors to kiss each other based on a random wheel, and aside from the inherent weirdness of that idea, Fiore is also A minor. So what I'm going to do is still have Crystal take over, with Chris and Chef taking a break, but because of Chris's demands, there can only be 1 kiss per team, with 6 pairs of 2 overall, and 4 of those pairs having to do some other challenge against one another, making it a best of 3 overall. So round 1 would be Ellie and Tom versus Jake and Dan, and the challenge is a blindfolded foot race. Because Gabby isn't here, Ellie doesn't feel like she can trust anyone, especially not Tom, who goes out of his way to not be noticed, and is just very secretive. Because of that, they lose to a blindfolded Dan, with Jake giving him more thorough directions, as they know each other a lot better. This creates a further divide between Tom and his team. Then for round 2, we have Gret and Miriam versus Lil and Fiore. And this challenge is a trust fall over the stage. Miriam insists Gret do the trust fall, and tells Gret about her suspicions of what she did to Will last episode in order to persuade her. She convinces her by saying if she catches her, she'll vote any way she wants, since Miriam knows Gret has been fishing for votes since the beginning of the competition, and she agrees. Because Miriam has a decent amount of upper body strength for an old lady, and she's expecting it, she catches Gret. Meanwhile, Lil forces Fiore to fall since she doesn't have the strength to catch Lil. Fiore argues, but Alec and Nick know Lil is right, so they don't argue with her when she goes full mom mode and tells Fiore to fall this instant. And Fiore very reluctantly obeys. Lil does manage to catch Fiore before hitting the ground, but Fiore sprains her ankle on the way down. Lil is apologetic and offers to tend to her wound, but Fiore yells at her to get away from her and call her an old hag. Lil is shocked and puts her hand on her mouth, while Alec rushes to help Fiore instead. So both teams get a point here, making the score 2-1 for the killer bass. Finally, we have the round that actually is a kiss, which is Nick and Alec versus Will and Ashley. And yeah, it's just whoever's first to kiss wins. Ashley gets ready to kiss him, quote-unquote casually, and obviously incredibly flustered and terrified, Will runs off stage out of fear, and Crystal says, "Whoa, tough break," as Ashley leaves the stage sad and embarrassed. After that, Alec looks at Nick and tells him, "Well, we may as well," and they kiss, winning their team immunity. After the challenge, Chef catches Tom with his walkie-talkie and confiscates it. Chef asks Tom who he was talking to. When Tom says no one, Chef gets in his face and repeats himself more slowly and threateningly. Just then, the other contestants turn on the lights and come into the cafeteria, asking what's going on. Chef grabs the walkie-talkie and confirms Tom is a spy, shocking his whole team. Figuring Tom has been made, he gets ready to lunge at Chef, but Chris gets in between the two, saying that won't be necessary, and instead shows Tom the contract for the show as well as the one he signed, proving that he and his agency don't have any dirt on them. Keep in mind, this is Chris and Chef from Season 1 of Total Drama we're talking about here, where things were the most straightforward and no major law violations like the mutated island or overly dangerous challenges or lawsuits were involved yet, meaning that neither Tom nor his agency have probable cause here. Chris decides not to punish Tom, though, and says it's better to just leave it to the others. Later that night, Will walks up to Ashley, and she tells him he really hurt her feelings. Will apologizes profusely and says it was fear getting in the way, but she tells him she can't trust someone who's led by fear, rubbing her hand on her arm. Will asks what she means by that, and not wanting to elaborate further, Ashley tells Will she'd rather be alone right now. leaving him to confide in Gret, playing right into her hands. He tells her everything, and Gret utilizes this opportunity to fill Will's head with lies about how Ashley never liked him as any more than an ally and for his challenge brawn. How frankly she's way out of his league anyway, and that if it hasn't been made clear by now, Gret is his only real friend in the game, which Will easily falls for. And with Will in her back pocket, Gret has no reason not to go along with the rest of her team in voting out Tom for being exposed as a spy. Because I have some other plans this episode, instead of everyone going around the campfire confessing their fears, I just said Crystal got them in individual interviews. Fiore would have had enough at this point, and plans on burning everyone's stuff and blaming Lil like in the original. But Alec convinces her to take the less destructive approach. Seeing as Jake and Dan are desperate to get votes on their side, Alec decides to play all sides, and have 2 4-person alliances in both directions. Beyond that, all the Alec and Fiore stuff in the original also happens. Now, even though Phobia Factor was a Total Drama Island episode, we kinda already know how most of these characters would react based on episode 2 of Disventure Camp Season 1, because it's a very similar challenge. Of the people here, Jake, Miriam, and Alec all refused to conquer their fears. And the only person who wasn't here originally was Will, and his greatest fear would be a roller coaster with Ashley, combining his physical and psychological fears together. Will freezes in terror as Ashley folds her arms and for the first time goes from disappointed to actively pissed at Will. Gret tells everyone to pack it up since he obviously can't do it, but Will ultimately caves and does it while screaming the entire time, including after the ride ends. Ashley calms him down and tells him she's proud of him. Will says thanks as he blushes, and just then Gret interrupts and tells him, "Great job, looks like my training rubbed off on you," which doesn't anger Ashley, but it persuades her to leave as it pretty much confirms in her head that despite winning the challenge, Will is still afraid when it comes to her. This makes the score 4-4 overall, causing a tie, and instead of a tiebreaker, Chris decides that both teams will have a combined vote at elimination. Now, there's a number of ways for this to go, as I think most of the Killer Bass want to use their numbers advantage to weed someone out on the other team, which is something both Gret and Miriam overhear. And as much as they don't trust each other, they both agree their goals are aligned this time, so they agree to vote together. But despite their team's plans, Fiore tells Alec she wants to use this opportunity to get rid of Lil since she hates her guts. And with Alec willing to follow her lead, decides it's not the worst idea since he can use this unique opportunity to create bonds with the other team now as well. So Alec decides to call a private meeting between him, Fiore, and Jake and Dan, as well as Gret and Miriam on the other team, and convinces all of them to vote for Lil. Jake and Dan are hesitant but realize it's worth it to vote off a team member to get into this even bigger alliance. Gret has a moment alone where she says to the camera that as much as she loves playing Will like a fiddle, it's nice to be surrounded by people who are just as smart as her sometimes. And between this mega alliance and the Will thing, she feels like she's unstoppable. So the mega alliance of 6 votes for Lil, and while Will gets 2 votes from Nick and Lil, and Alec gets 3 votes from Ellie, Will, and Ashley, both of which are just perceived as the biggest threats from each team, obviously Lil gets the most votes and is eliminated. While Fiore says, "Bye-bye, bitch," and Alec smiles at Fiore after Lil leaves. This is the second episode of Disventure Camp Season 1, the one with the big race where Will originally got eliminated. Nick would ask what happened and why Lil got eliminated, and Alec lies and says the other team must have ganged up on her, and also lies saying that Dan was the 6th vote. Because there's only 10 people left, and to make things easier for me to write, the challenge has 2 people at the first 2 sections of the challenge, while the one other person of each team does the last one. This way, 2 people can run up the hill, tag the second pair, then they cut the logs and ride them down the hill and grab the first 2 flags, and the last person to collect the final flag and builds the log ladder to get it wins. Gret suggests Will join her running up the hill, since it puts the least pressure on her, and she also has a good excuse to take Will with her since he'd be scared of riding the logs. Alec does the same with Nick to continue framing Dan as a mole to secure his safety in a future vote, which works since Nick has no reason not to trust him at this point. Both teams get to the top of the hill at roughly the same time. Fiore rides the logs with Dan since he's too small to build and climb the log ladder, and also because Fiore can repeat Alec's strategy and turn Dan against Nick by also painting him as the false mole. Meanwhile, on the Gophers, Ellie insists on being paired with Ashley, expressing that she wants to cheer her up, noticing that she seems down. Ellie privately says she doesn't know exactly what's going on between Will and Ashley, but what really matters to her is that she desperately needs an ally since she fears she's next if her team loses today. Originally, Fiore went to look for the immunity totem in this challenge, but since that doesn't exist this season, she'd have to be relied on to help with the challenge, and Dan also isn't that strong. So cutting the logs would be a bit of a hassle for them, whereas Ashley could do it a lot faster, and she and Ellie both grab the flags on the way down. The Screaming Gophers of course get there first, but Miriam being slower than Jake due to her old age evens it up a bit, until Ashley decides to lasso their flag at the last minute, right before Jake can grab it after building the log ladder. However, Chris interrupts the Screaming Gopher celebration and says Miriam was supposed to grab the flag, not Ashley. So they automatically forfeit and the Killer Bass win instead. Alec and Fiore are both ecstatic as they not only have full control over the team now, but they also have immunity, or just use one of their alliances on the other if they lose. Ashley is terrified of getting eliminated after her team glared at her after Chris's announcement. But luckily for her, she has Ellie in her corner now, who, given the circumstances, admits she needs Ashley in the game in order to ensure her survival. And she can't put her finger on it, but she knows there's something weird going on that she's not a part of. Ashley agrees to investigate with her, but first, they need a way to keep her safe. And I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that out of these three, they talk to Will to flip the vote, since he clearly has something for Ashley. Will says he doesn't know what to do and that Gret told him not to trust anyone, and Ellie points out it sounds like she's just projecting to keep him obedient. They pretty easily get him on board to not vote for Ashley, but he's still not willing to vote for Gret either, since he still trusts her. So they decide to compromise and vote off Miriam, who's been pretty grumpy and not all that useful anyway. So Gret and Miriam's votes towards Ashley are outweighed. Now at this point in the game, Miriam hasn't opened up, meaning she'd still be very bitter, and since her Mega Alliance didn't protect her, she has no reason to keep it a secret anymore. So she tells the rest of her team that Gret worked behind their backs and entered into an alliance with the opposing team, and describes the 6 votes against Lil last episode in detail to back up her accusation. This turns Will and the others squarely against Gret, leaving her in big trouble. Ellie is relieved she's finally no longer on the bottom. The challenge this episode is the Jousting tournament on the boats in the 2nd season of the reboot, which would be an issue here since there's 9 people, but luckily there's a scene at breakfast where Fiore throws her food on the floor saying it's disgusting and reminds her of the god-awful school cafeteria food, causing Chef to reveal himself behind her and growl at her. And in the very next scene we see Fiore forced to sit in a timeout chair, automatically eliminated from this challenge. Now because there's still teams in this version, it's no longer a tournament but a best of 4. Crystal tries to convince Chris to let her host this challenge, since she hasn't been able to since episode 3. And she'd be constantly begging but never given the chance, and complains that instead she got stuck with kitchen duty with Chef. Crystal doesn't give her what she wants. Gret convinces Alec to make his team lose on purpose, because if he doesn't and Gret inevitably gets eliminated when her team loses, the other 3 already knowing about the Mega Alliance will immediately tell everyone else about it, and he and Fiore will be screwed in the merge. Alec is forced to agree, but tells Gret she has to let him win first in order to not make it obvious. So after he wins his match with Gret, he purposefully bumps into Dan and snatches his glasses when no one is looking, then tells Dan that Nick stole them, making them furious at each other, with Nick being falsely accused of theft, and the two of them fight to the point of exhaustion, letting Will's fear become irrelevant since he's much bigger than Nick and knows he's tired out, and Dan is basically blind. So his match against Ellie ends with Ellie winning easily. And finally, for the 4th round, Ashley just beats Jake because she's stronger, pretty simple, meaning that the Killer Bass lose out on an opportunity for a tiebreaker and the Screaming Gophers win the challenge. Also, if you're wondering, the Screaming Gophers don't tell the Killer Bass about the alliance because Gret convinced them not to, so that way they'd basically get a free win, which Ellie convinces them to take that deal because of their dwindling numbers. After the challenge, Jake, being his impulsive self, tells his whole team he thinks Alec is a snake, but doesn't have the evidence or favor to back it up. So while Dan and Nick obviously vote for each other, and Jake votes for Alec out of suspicion, this leaves Alec and Fiore to decide the vote, and they pretty obviously vote for Jake, since they have a pretty good idea of what all the other votes are going to be, and correctly assume that 2 votes is enough to get Jake out of the game. Jake tells Dan he needs to open his eyes, literally, before walking off angry. Okay, and now we are at the merge. Before the merge is announced this episode, we get a little bonus scene at the beginning of the episode, showing Jake and Miriam getting along, and after Jake gets the news that his grandmother passed away, Miriam opens up to him about everything and the two become close like in the original. So now Chris announces the merge, since with 14-person cast, historically it tends to be either around or exactly 8 people, and also just because narratively it makes the most sense to have it placed here. This challenge is the one where everyone has to break something down and shove it through a hole, and first to do so wins immunity, from episode 9 of the 2nd season of the reboot. Before the objective is announced, everyone is told to find the biggest object they can. The alliance of the Screaming Gophers minus Gret pair up, and all look for the same object, hoping it will give them all the best chance at immunity. While Gret joins up with Alec and Fiore, Ellie tells her new team she overheard Crystal talking about a farm section on the island over the phone with someone. So they follow her around, hoping to find it since they don't have any better ideas. Nick and Dan are too busy trying and failing to get votes against the other to focus on the challenge, while Gret, Fiore, and Alec search around the island and eventually find the yacht that Caleb did originally. They all argue about who found it first since they all want immunity, until Chris announces that they have to fit it in a hole, and they switch to pointing the finger at each other. Nick puts his hat through the hole, and Chris tells him that's not big at all, and Nick confidently says he doubts anyone will do any better. Just then, Ashley and crew are all riding horses and can't control them, and they all fly off the saddle, ending with Ashley's hat falling off and accidentally flying through the hole. Chef measures Ashley and Nick's hats and confirms Ashley's is slightly bigger, so Dan cheers since Nick can no longer have immunity. Gret finds a large bucket to try and fit it in the hole, but she ends up breaking it. And Alec and Fiore both find sheep like Damien did, but they also break the hole. Chris is annoyed wondering where all the animals are coming from, and when Ashley tells him it was the farm, he gets mad because that was supposed to be a future challenge, but now the surprise factor is ruined, so they have to cancel it. And during this pissed off rant, Crystal gets a really nervous look on her face. But before the clock runs out, Fiore actually does something really smart and sticks a bunch of stuff to a giant piece of used bubblegum, making it just big enough that it's bigger than both hats, but small enough to fit through the hole, winning her immunity. She would get this idea from trying to get as creative as possible with making the nuns suffer. Now at this point, there's nothing to stop Ashley, Will, and Ellie from telling Nick and Dan about Gret's two-faced nature. But the problem is that they hate each other way more than they care about that. And on top of that, Gret would also confirm it to both Nick and Dan, but add in that her team knew about it and chose to keep it a secret so they could win a challenge, only revealing it now when it suits them most. Which makes sense to them, but it still doesn't change them voting for each other. So with Nick and Dan voting for each other, this essentially puts both three-person alliances at a stalemate. So Fiore and Alec decide it's better not to risk a tie and agree to vote off Dan with Nick to get him fully back into the alliance, hoping that it'll give them the numbers advantage again. And Ashley, Ellie, and Will are all dead set on Gret, so Gret's 3 votes and Nick's 1 vote get outweighed by Dan's 4. This is episode 11 of Disventure Camp Season 1, the Cave Challenge. As Nick integrates himself more with the evil trio, they all start to get really annoyed by him, but tolerate him for the sake of having a numbers advantage. Will and Ashley are growing notably closer together, which worries Ellie as she privately expresses her concerns about being a third wheel. But there's not really much she can do about it since basically everyone else seems to be against them. The challenge is the underground cave filled with spiders from Disventure Camp Season 1 Episode 11, but because there are 7 people now, I used a random number generator to decide which 2 people get empty flashlights, which 4 people get 1 battery each, and which person gets nothing. Ashley and Gret get the flashlights, Will, Nick, Ellie, and Alec all get the batteries, and Fiore gets nothing. After Fiore opens her bag to find nothing, Alec gives her his flashlight and gives her a piggyback ride. And when they, along with Gret, get ambushed by a spider, they throw the flashlight and battery at it and run off without thinking. And shortly after, Nick shouts through the cave that they left it there. But when they don't come back, Nick decides to keep it for himself since between his supplies and Alec and Fiore's, he now has a fully functioning flashlight. Gret is left screwed with nothing but a single battery, so she decides to forfeit the challenge altogether and ride the elevator back up to sneak up on the host to figure out the future of the competition. Her logic is that she doesn't think she needs immunity since her alliance makes up the majority of the votes anyway, and she always feels more secure when she has some sort of advantage, which she has nothing of the sort in the cave now. Gret finds Crystal talking on the phone with somebody, talking about how frustrated she is that Chris won't let her do anything important, and then Gret steps in and asks her who she's talking to. Crystal says no one, hiding the phone behind her back, and Gret quickly discovers she's hiding something, but instead of using it against her, offers to have a secret alliance with Crystal to earn her trust and get unofficial favors in the game. Since she knows there's no one left in the game she can really count on to be her meat shield. Crystal tells her all about how she's secretly been seeing this guy named Derek and has been going on dates with him around the island behind Chris's back. But they're worried about getting caught having to sneak in and out of the kitchen for food with Chef watching. So, Gret agrees to get food for them in exchange for illegal help, and the two shake on it. Meanwhile, back at the cave, Ellie gets separated from Will and Ashley due to the darkness and gets attacked by a giant spider, forcing her to run around aimlessly, which begins to build resentment between her and her allies. Meanwhile, Will and Ashley are still together, with Will being absolutely terrified, constantly holding Ashley's hand tight, which she consoles him, and she swings them across a chasm with her lasso, which converts Will's fear into excitement, and he starts to become more useful, to the point where they're about to reach the end, until they're confronted by yet another giant spider. And before Ashley can grab his hand to run away, Will finally musters up the courage to stand up for himself and punch the spider in the eye, which pisses it off even more, but it also gives them just enough time to skip around it and run as fast as they can. They end up running right into Nick, who at this point has been strutting along without a care in the world, and accidentally breaks his flashlight in the process, leaving them scrambling, giving Alec and Fiore just enough time to get out of the cave and win the challenge. Well, they would win, except Gret very conveniently managed to get there an hour ago, and Crystal declares Gret the winner of today's challenge. Ellie asks where Chris and Chef are, and Crystal tells her they're on break, and when Alec asks Gret how she could have possibly gotten there so fast, she says she's just that good, which Alec doesn't believe for a second, and privately to the camera says he knows something fishy is going on here and he intends to get to the bottom of it. We see Gret return the favor to Crystal by sneaking past Chef in the kitchen to grab the food for Crystal and Derek, who we now see in the flesh for the first time. And Alec and Ellie butt heads as they both watch Gret's conversation with the host from afar. Alec and Ellie both tell each other that they have the batteries, and since Alec knew that Nick had a battery and Ellie knew that Will had a battery, it clicks into place that Gret couldn't have possibly won without pulling some strings. And they decide to make a temporary truce between the alliances because a cheater playing during the merge is no good for anyone. When word gets out that Gret must have cheated, she gets all 6 other votes, with her 1 vote going to Will since she can no longer exploit him. With Gret having immunity, this cancels out all her votes, and Gret tells Will that she admires his courage, but it also means that she can't use him anymore, so he's a threat that's gotta go. And she also condescendingly taunts the players, asking them if they forgot how the game works, since they can't vote for someone who has immunity, which Crystal reminds everyone is correct. However, Chris then barges into the ceremony and says, "Yeah, about that. I was at the spa getting a facial when I heard rumors that someone has been breaking the rules. Can't have that. Kills the ratings, dog." Crystal maintains her smirk and says it's a good thing no one cheated then, giving a subtle nod to Gret. But Chris then says, "You sure about that?" Then snaps his fingers, cueing Chef to play the video recording Gret and Crystal's conversation in the kitchen. It turns out Chef was recording them the whole time and then purposefully took a power nap when he knew Gret would come steal the food, even leaving the fridge and door creaked open, which he normally never does. Gret is in shock when Chef walks up to her and says, "Aw, don't worry. I'm always happy to feed those who appreciate my cooking. I even added my own special sauce," holding a bottle of mysterious goo with a black skeleton on it. And then we see Gret vomit on the boat of losers as she's escorted out. Chris then glares at Crystal and fires her in front of everyone, saying she can't be trusted with showbiz anymore, and so Crystal joins Gret on the boat of losers, stewing in her bitterness. The episode ends with Alec having a private moment where he says it's nice to know cheating doesn't pay, but now he's going to have to do something about the numbers being even again between the two alliances. Now, this episode is interesting because a lot of what happens here is sort of similar to the original, only it's combined with a lot of the events of episode 10 of Disventure Camp as well. Because of all the build-up and downtime this episode's challenge provides, Will and Ashley finally kiss and officially start dating, proving that Will not only conquered his fear of the dark and giant spiders last episode, but his nerves around Ashley in this episode. Ellie sees this happen in secret with a very nervous look on her face, with a private confessional saying that she's freaking out because this leaves her the most exposed, and just then is spooked by Fiore and Alec. After berating them for scaring her and also being suspicious that they're stalking her with how weirdly often they seem to butt heads, Alec and Fiore convince Ellie to switch sides, since Ashley and Will are way too close. Alec and Fiore also point out that Nick is a spoiled rich asshole, and having to deal with and trust someone like him is antithetical to Ellie's constant financial struggle, so she's better off joining them over anyone else, and not getting stuck with 3rd or 4th place. Because Ellie was convinced originally, and it's less personal than it was before between her and Alex since he never voted her off, she agrees to sabotage her friend's relationship to split them apart. Only instead of Jake and Tom's, this time it's Will and Ashley's. Ellie pulls Will aside and tells him the same stuff she did about Tom, and it happens on the dock the same way Heather did to Trent this episode. The main difference being that there's no kiss, obviously, between Ellie and Will, but she does add the detail that Ashley burned her farm down for a party, something that Ashley would tell Ellie and Will after the fear challenge and her just, opening up to them and stuff. And that, on top of all the lies that Ashley is just using Will and his fear of messing things up with her, completely turn him against her. But he's not even angry, he's just hurt and disappointed. Ellie feels really guilty about it, especially after he hugs her and thanks her for being honest with him. And during the vote, since there's no immunity totem, the plan is much simpler. Alec and Fiore vote for Ashley. They already got Will to vote for her as well now, since he thinks she's been using him, so all they gotta do is tell Ellie to vote for her, and bam. 4 votes is the majority, so Ashley is out. Fiore brags about Ashley's undoing, exposing Ellie in the process similar to the original, turning Will completely against Ellie, leaving Nick nowhere to go whether he disapproves of their tactics or not. You may be wondering why I haven't talked about the actual challenge, and that's because it barely matters. They all have to get random things in hard-to-get places, but only one person gets immunity by sheer luck if they find it. I used the random number generator to figure out who gets immunity, and sure enough, it landed on Fiore, which is fitting since plot armor seemed like a driving factor in this episode originally anyway. Plus, this episode originally had like twice as many people, so trying to figure out who would search for which object just feels pointless since, again, the focus of this episode had very little to do with the challenge anyway. Will feels horrible and apologizes to Ashley, and promises not to let fear get in the way anymore, which stops her from walking away, and she asks him if he really means that. Will explains in a long zoom-in that he really does mean that, because now he sees that letting fear get the better of him might have just cost him the best girl in the world. And it definitely cost her a chance at $1 million, and he'll never forgive himself for that. Hearing this, I don't think Ashley would feel all better, but given that she is a very forgiving and understanding person, to the point where she tolerates Jake as much as she does in the original, I think she pats Will's shoulder and tells him she'll be cheering for him back at the hotel. This challenge is the cake baking one from the reboot season 2, where they were split into 3 teams. But with only 5 people left this time, the 3 teams are only composed of 2 people each, with Chef joining in on the action. Now, because Trial by Triathlon and Island clearly wasn't random when it came to picking the teams, and this is technically based off of Season 1, I picked what pairs I thought Chris would find the most entertaining, which were Ellie and Will, Alec and Nick, and Fiore and Chef. As they're going to get the ingredients, Will throws a bunch of the supplies at Ellie as they're getting them, as revenge for what she did to Ashley, and Chef blows his whistle and demands Fiore run as fast as him to get the stuff, exhausting her, and she says privately that this is just like gym class, but worse. Alec is profusely annoyed by Nick, but admits it could be worse looking over at Chef. Now, it doesn't really make sense to have Owen make a cameo since this video is meant to be the first season of its universe, so while the other 2 remotes are the same with shaking the table and getting a tip from Chef, the third one would be dumping an enormous pile of slimy codfish onto the opposing team's food. Alec and Nick pick the fish since they got the supplies the fastest, and Ellie and Will pick the rumbling table next, leaving Fiore with Chef's advice, which is basically useless with him already on her team, but it doesn't stop him from telling Fiore her food sucks after tasting it, which Fiore screams back at him that she's 8 years old and doesn't know how to cook. So I would say it's between the other 2 teams for whose cake is the best. And to be honest, I don't think anyone here really knows how to bake all that well, but I'm pretty confident that Alec could just tell Ellie to throw Will under the bus with how much they hate each other now, especially since in the original, Ellie was still willing to work with Alec even after he betrayed her, at least when it was convenient for her. So with that, Alec and Win win immunity. And also, we know that Alec reads a lot, so it's not hard to imagine that he's at least read a few cookbooks here and there. And I imagine that in his years living in that gigantic mansion, Nick might have a personal chef, and even though he's not very smart or observant, he could have at least picked up a few tips from him. So for all of those reasons, I'm going to say that Alec and Nick win immunity here. Now for the vote, I seriously considered whether Nick would actually betray Alec and Fiore, fearing that they'd be too strong together, and try to get Ellie and Will to vote Fiore off with him. But I decided against this for 2 reasons. 1, Will is a much bigger threat, not only because of his size, but also his newfound confidence despite his usual clumsiness. And 2, Alec and Fiore surprisingly never actually betrayed Will. I mean, they did lie to him, but they still chose him over Dan with that whole situation. And while Fiore insults him sometimes, they never really stabbed him in the back in any meaningful way. So Will would get all 4 of the other votes, and gets told to get lost by everyone else when he's shocked and confused. Will leaves proud of himself and happy he has Ashley in his life now, who he can't wait to see back at the motel. This episode features a prominent Crystal B plot, with her and Derek plotting revenge on Chris for kicking them out. It shows them gathering a bunch of materials from a bunch of hardware stores in a suburban area off the island. Anyway, before the challenge, Nick approaches Alec and tells him he wants to go to the finale with him. Shortly after, Ellie comes by to say the exact same thing. Allie says yes to both of them, but privately expresses his disdain for all the quote-unquote popularity, saying the last thing he needs is a target on his back with too many people breathing down his neck. Or worse, people actually relying on him, which he says with an exasperated sigh, obviously referring to his personal life as well. This episode's challenge is also from the reboot season 2 with the dogs. Unlike Owen, MacArthur's presence here doesn't necessarily break continuity, so you know what, why not? Obviously, no one here can outrun any of the dogs, I mean that's kind of the point. But I think Nick would be the first to be out 3 times because he would think he can get the dogs to obey him, mistakenly associating them with the Pavlov-trained dogs his rich parents own at home. Alec would be sneaking around the island looking for treats and stuff to hopefully distract the dogs with if he gets caught, while Fiore sits in a hiding spot inside a cabin closet only she can fit into, having only getting caught once thus far, as opposed to Alec and Ellie, who are both caught twice. Ellie accidentally finds Fiore as she looks for a place to hide. Fiore tells her to shoo, but Ellie refuses to go out there and risk being mauled again. And if anything, Fiore should be the one on the front line, since Ellie got rid of Will and Ashley for her. Fiore has a private moment where she says she admits Ellie has been pretty useful, and she's way less annoying than Nick, so she decides to ask Ellie how she feels about going to the final two with her, pointing out her odds are pretty good against an 8-year-old as opposed to 2 grown men. When Ellie questions Fiore's willingness to stay true to this pact, Fiore explains how she finds Nick really annoying, and though she does like Alec, that's exactly why she doesn't want to take him to the finale, because in her own words, feelings are for weak people. Ellie smirks and says Fiore definitely makes a good point, and the two of them come up with a long-term plan. Alec is seen making a trail of treats away from his hiding spot, only for him to back right into the really small, aggressive dog that had it out for Caleb, and get caught a 3rd time. Because he trusts Fiore the most, she begrudgingly decides to let Ellie win the challenge in order to put herself out in the open, to go talk to him and make sure he's on board to vote out Nick. And this way, with Ellie winning immunity, it's not like they have many other options left at that point anyway. So Ellie wins immunity, and in a 3-1 vote, Nick is eliminated. Nick is super bitter and pissed off at this betrayal, but everyone just tells him he was really annoying, and frankly they were surprised this didn't happen to him sooner. Now, when it comes to this challenge, you can never really tell exactly how it would play out outside of its original context. With the eliminated players' dares being different, Owen not being here so all the gross stuff involving him can't happen, there's just way too many delicate variables to juggle, so the only way to really determine who wins and loses is just measuring how these 3 do in a constant endurance test of weird shit. And right off the bat, Ellie has made it clear she'll do whatever it takes to win, short of letting someone die, and even then she retracted that in an interview after it happened, so I think it's safe to say it's not her who's going home here. And between Fiore and Alec, while Fiore is a child, I imagine she'd be more used to germs and other stuff, weird pranks and the like, that she might have already been used to given her mischievous nature, whereas Alec really doesn't seem like the type to want to get his hands dirty. Plus, in Disventure Camp we saw Ellie and Fiore team up to take Alec out, with both of them thinking he's a bigger threat, so I see no reason why they wouldn't combine their freebies like Gwen and Owen did to the same effect here. The only difference is Miriam isn't here as the middleman to make that happen, however, it only being a matter of time before Fiore betrays Alec, as well as Ellie being passively antagonized by Alec for a sizable chunk of the game, are still both things that happen in this version. So again, I think they still gang up on Alec. On top of that, the dare that the loser did in the original episode was having their head shaved, and we know Alec's greatest fear is losing his hairdo, which means that even if he doesn't have to do that here, there's a good chance he'll have to either do something similar or worse to stay in the game, and I think at a certain point, he just won't be able to keep up with Fiore or Ellie. There's also a scene at the end where Derek tells Crystal to get in his car, and she asks, so what exactly is the plan again? And Derek says, don't worry, I know a guy. The finale of this season is the finale from Total Drama Island, I mean, fitting. However, I'm still going to keep the rule from Disventure Camp that each finalist gets 1 helper, while everyone else is just the peanut gallery, regardless of which side they're rooting for. Fiore chooses Alec as her helper since even though she betrayed him, he's not as angry as he was in the original, because unlike there, he knows he probably would have lost I Triple Dog Dare You anyway, and it makes a lot more sense for Fiore to make the move she did here from a pragmatic perspective, which I think Alec would respect. Besides, Ellie also betrayed him, and he still has a personal connection to Fiore, so it's kind of a win-win, or I guess a lose-lose depending on how you look at it. Meanwhile, Ellie recruits Gabby, since even though they obviously didn't have nearly as much time together here than in the original, she's the only one here that actually likes her and can relate to her on being an outcast and not be judgmental of the orthodox way she treats others and navigates the world. Of course, they wouldn't be a couple yet, but they'd have a few moments before Gabby's elimination and have an unspoken respect for each other. I don't really think there'd be any sabotage, despite some people here maybe having some inclinations, because neither of the finalists are that well liked, so it doesn't really make any sense to put that much effort in anyway. I think Fiore gets the lead during the climbing up the greasy flagpole thing, since she's smaller and used to sticky stuff like that at recess, and after that, Alec would carry Fiore across the shark-infested water, and while Ellie is falling behind, Gabby tells her not to give up and that she deserves to be happy no matter what other people think, stopping Ellie from doubting herself. Because people are selfish anyways, and would have done the same thing if they were in her position. Other things that happen include Will and Ashley fully patching things up, and fully dating now, since Ashley is a very forgiving person, and it's clear Will has grown a lot since the beginning of the season. Also, Tom would have come out of his shell a bit with no reason to hide his face anymore, and is good friends with Jake and Dan, which is shown back at the hotel in the beginning of the episode. Anyway, because this is meant to be a reiteration of TDI, both players get alternate endings, but unlike the other Total Drama seasons, one of them is officially the canon one, which in this case I think is Ellie, for both narrative purposes as well as just because I think it's the most likely outcome. In Ellie's ending, Alec tries to throw a rock at her, but Gabby catches it midair, yells and leaps in the air as she tackles Fiore to the ground, letting Ellie cross the finish line right after Fiore escapes. In Fiore's ending, Alec throws the rock and misses Ellie but hits Gabby in the chest, causing Ellie to stop in her tracks and help Gabby up, which gives Fiore enough time to cross the finish line first and win. In both endings, Chris and Chef are still hurled into the lake, but the last scene is no longer that, but rather it's Jensen with an earpiece saying he transported all the show's money, including the prize money, into an alternate untraceable account, something that the contestants nor the hosts know about before the season ends, leaving it on a cliffhanger. Yeah, that was the video. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately I had to sacrifice a lot of the really strong plot lines from Disventure Camp Season 1, but hey, on the plus side, Chris and Chef got to cross paths with them, and Will and Ashley at least got a bigger arc, so yeah. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if anyone is interested in me continuing this timeline, whether it's via my Patreon, or even if you just want to leave a comment on YouTube, feel free to let me know, as well as if you have any other ideas. Next video is probably going to be Disventure Camp All-Stars related, as that season is finally wrapping up, so yeah, see you then.